Bruno.
Hey Nick, how are you?
Good and you.
Good, good.
Good. Welcome back, everyone. We're doing another episode of PLA today. We've got two questions for you. And Bruno, we'll start with yours. The question that's come in today is basically surrounding Section 14 of the Consumer Protection Act. So the question says that a tenant of an apartment has given notice that they want to leave their lease agreement early. The landlord has decided that they're going to repaint the unit and then essentially sell the unit rather than reletting it to another tenant in the circumstances. And the question is, does the penalty still apply in circumstances where an owner is not going to be renting out the property once again?
So early termination of a lease is early termination of the lease, right? And we need to remember that. I think taking a step back, we've forgotten as consumers that when we agree to something, that people normally place a lot of reliance on that agreement and actually being able to either collect money or collect services or make supplies in terms of that agreement. So these consumer laws that exist are there to protect the consumer, but one cannot take away from the fact that there is going to be some harm that's going to be suffered by a person canceling something before the parties had agreed it should be cancelled, right? Either way, early termination is early termination, and it's something that should be considered an exception and not simply accepted across the board as, you know, I'll walk out of this lease whenever I feel like walking out of this lease. Now, that is why the reasonable cancellation penalty exists. And this is in terms of Section 14 of the Consumer Protection Act. So yes, it does give this consumer the power or the right to exit a long-term agreement early. And yes, you know what, sometimes this is necessary because circumstances change and life changes. And maybe we do need to try and help in situations where there's a sudden change that requires a tenant to exit so that they can make better decisions for themselves. But that being said, if there's an early termination, there is a right that a landlord has to claim a reasonable cancellation penalty. Now, what is a reasonable cancellation penalty? It's a number of factors that are being taken into account in order to calculate what a reasonable penalty would be. And this would be, for example, the harm that's being caused to the landlord, the loss of rent or prospective rent, the commission that needs to be paid to another agent to go procure another tenant. There's a number of factors, including the time frame that is left on the lease, right? And that is quite a big factor. Why? Because in the past, that's actually how we calculated damages. If there was some kind of early breach or termination, we'd see how many months are left and we'd start calculating based on that. Now, in this particular question, the landlord, so the tenant did give the early notice, but the landlord has decided not to rent the property out again. Now, is the landlord still entitled to early cancellation penalty? And the answer is yes. Just because the landlord now made a decision to go in a different direction doesn't mean that that lease would have lasted another 6 months, for example, that the landlord would have received rental for another 6 months. So it's very possible that there has been harm that's been suffered and that the landlord would have preferred to stay in the lease, but now has pivoted another way in order to be able to get out of this property investment. That does not necessarily mean that a reasonable cancellation penalty is not going to be levied. And again, one has to look at all the circumstances in order to determine what a reasonable penalty should be, and not simply the fact that now the landlord's not renting the property out and is instead selling the property. And again, the length of time to find a new tenant is only but one consideration. If the landlord isn't going to find another tenant, then one can look at what a reasonable time would have been, or how long was left on the lease, how much more rent the landlord would have actually been able to collect over that period of time. So there's a whole bunch of different circumstances, and one is to consider all of them in the lease and in the situation that you're dealing with.